are having an expert in literacy who is going to share with us 3 science of reading research-based strategies that we can use to support our teaching of multisyllabic decodable skills for 3rd through 5th graders. I'm so excited about that. You know, we always talk about our early readers, K through 2, but now we get some strategies that are going to help us build on all of those things that we learn about and help our 3rd through 5th graders learn and decode and become stronger readers. So that's exciting. My name is Terry King Hunt. I am the Impact Manager for Just Right Reader. Just Right Reader is a company whose mission is to make reading fun and for students to learn by reading engaging and decodable readers that are representative of students of America's schools. Our science of reading decodables engage students in authentic phonics practice in the classroom and at home through our classroom libraries and our take-home decodable packs. We are so excited about the work that is being done through the science of reading, and we are so proud to sponsor today's ED webinar. So I am so excited, and I'm grateful that each of you are here. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Laura Tortorelli. Dr. Tortorelli is an associate professor of elementary literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Her scholarship examines the text, technology, and instructional practices that support early reading acquisition. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the International Literacy Association. She has been named an emerging scholar by the Reading Hall of Fame, and she is a visiting researcher by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is currently an associate editor of the Reading Teacher. So y'all, please help me welcome Dr. Tortorelli as I turn the platform over to her. Thank you for being here, Dr. Tortorelli.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, I am so excited to be here with you today to talk about 3 strategies to accelerate reading achievement for 3rd to 5th grade developing readers. I'm particularly excited because this is a newer area of my research. As Terry said, when we think about the science of reading, when we're talking about it on social media, when it's floating around on podcasts, we're almost always talking about something that looks like this picture that I'm showing right here, which is pretty young kids sitting with their teacher, working through letter sound correspondence in single syllable words like bit, sit, fit, and hit. And that's what we think of as the science of reading. But in fact, a lot of my research, but in fact, it's actually a lot more than that. And a lot of my research at the beginning focused on these beginning readers. But over time, I have become more and more interested in what happens next. And particularly post-pandemic, thinking about how we can support kids who still need support with their reading and word reading development while they're also in those higher grades. So my research has really shifted along with the needs that I've seen in the classroom to think about what kids need after this initial decoding stage. So if you look here, this slide shows the stair-step progression of words that kids need to learn to read in texts. They start out with those simple one-syllable, fairly transparent words, bat to ball, getting lots and lots of phonics instruction and support reading those words in what we call in decodable texts that match their instruction. That's a great first step. But what comes after that? Well, they immediately, in kindergarten, 1st grade, actually need to learn to read words that have multiple syllables. They need to be able to apply their phonics skills to recognize words like outside and under. However, they're usually pretty good at that too, because those are very familiar words that they know from their oral language that show up with a lot of frequency in text. But every year, the stair step gets a little bit harder. The things that they're expected to read every year throughout elementary school include harder and rarer words, to the point where you get up into 4th and 5th grade texts, where kids are actually encountering words in text that they've never heard before, and that they've definitely never seen before, and are very long, like disorganization or equilibrium. And these words are related to words that they know and they've seen before, like organize or equal or equity. But they're a lot of letters, and they need a lot of support to decode those words, figure out what they mean in those contexts, and have a successful reading experience with texts. I think by third grade, 65% of the unique words in grade level texts are multisyllabic words like these. And informational texts in particular have a lot of new content vocabulary that include multisyllabic words. So what we're talking about today is how we get kids from this bottom stair step to the top stair step. And this is, as I mentioned, the pandemic was one of the reasons I got interested in this topic and how to support those older kids, because more and more kids need a little bit of extra support in those upper grades. These are the fourth grade National Assessment of Educational Progress results for the past 20 years. And you can see that pretty consistently, 30% of kids are proficient or advanced, about 30% are scoring at the basic level, and about 30% are below basic. So only about a third of kids at any given year are performing at what that test would consider to be a proficient reading level. You can see that we made a little bit of progress, actually. Things were kind of improving as far as how many kids were scoring at that proficient or advanced level right before the pandemic. And then we started slinking back down to where we were 20 years ago. And so that's an important thing to keep track of, because those are real kids who are having real experiences reading in school, and not being able to read the text that you're expected to read impacts your motivation. It impacts your lifetime academic achievement, and it impacts how likely you are to stay in school. And Freddie Hebert has done an analysis of kids who score at the below basic and basic levels on these tests. And she estimates that about 80% of them are still having some difficulties with word reading, but not necessarily single syllable decoding. Most of these kids actually have mastered that initial phonics stage, what we think of as the science of reading, but they're having difficulty with these rarer multisyllabic words that they only encounter in text. Interestingly, some researchers at the Educational Testing Service also did a series of follow-up studies looking at these NAEP results pre-pandemic. And what they found was that the best predictors of whether or not kids were going to be able to pass this test were multisyllabic decoding skills, reading fluency, but not necessarily how quickly kids were reading, but how accurately they were able to read the words in the text, and background knowledge for the topics in the passage, but the topics of the passages in the test. But again, not necessarily, but not necessarily general background knowledge, but really focused in on content areas of vocabulary. So words like ecosystem or constitution, knowing those, being able to read those words, being able to recognize them in text accurately, and also being able to know what they mean, is what the kids who are struggling with reading in fourth and fifth grade and tests like that are really struggling with. So what that means is that they're in for a really rough time in school. Kids encounter 20,000 new words that they haven't seen before each year in elementary school. 90% of those new words are multisyllabic, and 60 to 80% of them are words that are derived from other words. It's the way disorganization is derived from organize. And those unfamiliar words tend to carry the meaning in informational text particularly. If you don't know the meaning, you're going to miss them. So here's an example of an upper grade level text. And just on this one page, you can see that there are proper nouns like Jupiter that are multisyllabic. There are content area vocabulary like hydrogen and helium words that are multisyllabic. There are compound words like spacecraft. And then there are derived forms of words like Voyager and ignited. So even on a very short page of text, they're encountering words like this over and over again. And there was research on what kids that are in these upper grade levels tend to do when they encounter these words, and it's not great. If they're left to their own devices, they tend to skip these words entirely. I'm sure you've seen kids do that. Pronounce the first few sounds and then sort of guess the rest. So for example, I'll share some examples on the next slide, but things like seeing ecosystem and just saying ecology, because that's a word that they know that starts with eco. Or try one plausible pronunciation, but give up before they find a word that makes sense to them or that matches the text. Leave off the suffixes that derive the word, so disorganize instead of disorganization. Use the wrong vowel sound, particularly people who are multilingual students who speak languages that have way fewer vowel sounds. They'll just try one vowel sound and get the wrong one. Use some of the word parts, but not all, or use context to guess. And this, of course, breaks my heart because we spend all of this time teaching the littles, not to use context to guess, to look at the letters and sounds and figure out the word. And then what we find is when they get to these harder words, if they haven't been provided with the instruction and the tools they need to read them, they revert back into that strategy of using context to guess. So here are some examples. Kids might read the word mysterious as mystery. They might read justice as just ice. They might read springtime as spring, which can work, but not always. They might read beautiful as beetle, or adventure as advice. So you can see how if you're trying to talk about, for example, the Supreme Court justices, reading that as just ice is going to be very confusing for you. You're not going to get the meaning of the text. Here's an example text that I created using what we know about what the readers in 3rd through 5th grade who are struggling with multisyllabic words tend to do. This is an informational text called Matters Everywhere. And this is an example of what it looks like when kids substitute in words that using some of those strategies I mentioned on the previous slide. Weaken identity metals according to a vary of propellers. Scientists have determined several different measurements to help label materials. Some examples are temporary, hardness, color, and length. Usually, these are used to measure solids like rocks and miners. However, temporary can be used to measure liquids as well. When geography study rocks, you get the idea. I won't read the whole thing. But think about how that feels when you're reading that way and missing that many words. It doesn't feel, it doesn't feel like you are a good reader. It doesn't boost your confidence. It's not a very fluent reading, and it isn't going to help you learn very much about the topic. So it's actually really important that we think about how to support kids in getting through that challenge. Wang and his team at Educational Testing Service have described this as the decoding threshold, that basically kids need to learn how to decode and figure out new words that they encounter in text, including multisyllabic words. And they need to get pretty good at that by the end of 5th grade. And what they have found in their research, looking at educational testing data longitudinally, so starting in 5th grade and following kids through middle and high school, is that if they don't get pretty good at that, meet what they call the decoding threshold by the end of 5th grade, they really don't show much growth in comprehension in the following years. Their test scores kind of hover right around where they're at, because it's really hard to learn from text if you aren't actually able to read the words accurately. And they estimate that about 38% of 5th grade students are not there right now. So by the end of elementary school, that third that is, kind of matches up with those kids who keep scoring below basic on the NAEP, are really not quite where they need to be as far as word recognition for these longer words. And so this research is pretty clear that instruction that includes multisyllabic decoding can make a difference. So that's the good news. We do know that we can teach kids to read these longer words, and that when we do that, it improves their word recognition, their reading fluency, and their reading confidence, which of course makes a lot of sense when you think about the experience of reading a text with a bunch of wrong words substituted in. But we want to make sure we're doing this multisyllabic word instruction in a way that mirrors what we know from reading science about how kids learn words. So it's not necessarily just about connecting the word the letters and sounds in relationship to the the letters and the sounds, and figuring out how to decode a word that way. They absolutely do need to connect the spelling and the pronunciation of the word. But they also need to connect those things to the meaning of that word. That's how a word is stored in memory. It's stored by connecting up the spelling, the pronunciation, and the meaning of the word. And a lot of words, like even a simple word like rock, have multiple meanings. Like rock can mean a stone, a back and forth motion, or a type of music. And so when kids encounter new words in texts, we want to make sure they're not just sounding them out or taking a guess at what the word is, but really paying attention to how the word is spelled, thinking about plausible ways to sound it out and trying to connect it to a word they may have heard before. And then connecting it to a context-appropriate meaning. When we encounter words over and over again in different texts, we accumulate more knowledge about the different meanings that that word can have. And then if you have a really strong lexical representation of that word in your memory, you're going to be better able to connect the base word to derived forms of the word. So rocked to rocks, rocking, bedrock, other words that have that word part in it. And so we want to make sure that we're providing students with instruction that attends to all these different parts of the word, because that's what helps them store those words in memory and make them accessible for meaning making and comprehension the next time they encounter that word in a text. So with that in mind, I have 3 strategies that I want to talk to you about today that are derived from research that can really accelerate children's reading growth in these upper elementary grades. These are things that I am using in my current research projects to make sure that we are helping kids helping best prepare kids for the reading tasks that they have in the upper elementary grades and the secondary grades. So the first strategy is syllable and morpheme instruction. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that looks like and how it might be a little different from what you have in your curricula, what you've done in the past. Then the next one is called Every Syllable Has at Least One Vowel, or for short, it's called ESHLAV. Terrible name, but great strategy. It's from Rolanda O'Connor at UC Irvine. And then the final one is called Wide Reading. And I will say that these come from my own reading of the research, but they also are echoed in the practice guide that came out from the Institute of Educational Sciences last year, called Providing Reading Interventions for Students in Grades 4 through 9. All of these strategies are mentioned as evidence-based practices in the practice guide as well. But I want to first talk about syllable and morpheme instruction, because we are very good, or getting very good, many of us are, at teaching kids word parts up until about mid through second grade. We teach them the short vowels, we teach them the long vowels, we teach them the silent E, the magic E, we teach them vowel teams and diphthongs and R-controlled vowels and all of these parts that help them read single syllable words. But all of these parts reoccur in these multisyllabic words. And they need practice reading these in using these word parts to decode both single syllable and multisyllabic words. So one thing that I always push for is that, especially by the end of first grade, having kids practice their phonics elements in both single and multisyllabic words is a great way to help them make those connections. But then we need to not stop our phonics instruction, and we need to move on to teaching common syllables and common morphemes. And by common syllables, I mean collections of letters that show up again and again in the same order in lots of different words. So for example, BER shows up at the end of lots and lots of words and at the beginning of a few words too. So when you see those, you know that's a letter cluster and it's familiar to you. And you can analogize from other words that end or begin with that cluster. But also common morphemes. Morphemes include things like prefixes and suffixes that you can add to base words. And these, of course, show up all the time because they are things that are added to a number of words to make different words. For example, able at the end of readable, reasonable, acceptable, and disposable. And we want to teach these bigger word parts because kids need them to decode new words that they come across in text, but also to remember those words and store them in memory and distinguish them from other similar looking words. To distinguish ecosystem from ecological, they need to pay attention to all the different chunks in that word, right? Not just the first chunk. And then they can also use those to analogize from words they know to other words. Teaching common syllables is not something that I see done very much. Usually what we do is teach syllabication rules or syllable types. But in fact, just teaching kids that when they see EX in a word, it's often its own syllable, and it's often pronounced, well, I pronounce it X. Other people pronounce it different ways. But so that will give them a running start reading expert, exactly, example, expecting, exclusion, exhibit, extravagant. And so this is a list here of common syllables: ter, x, com, t, bull, d, re, and, etc. That just show up a lot in different words. And once kids can recognize those, that helps them get a running start in breaking those words apart and decoding them. Even more important than common syllables, however, are common morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest meaningful word parts. So just like phonemes are the smallest units of sound, morphemes are the smallest units of meaning. And these do reoccur across lots and lots of words. So they're very useful for kids to know. And they can be, they can help with decoding because they can function, they can function as those chunks, like as a one syllable chunk, but they can also be multisyllabic. For example, semi and auto are morphemes that are multiple syllables. So that allows kids to recognize and break words into bigger chunks and recognize them more quickly. And the great thing about morphemes is that they have meaning associated with them, so that they help kids decode words and give them a clue what they might mean. So in the word semi-automation, for example, that's 14 different letter sound correspondences. If you tried to sound it out one at a time, you would have to make so many guesses about the different vowel sounds, and you'd have to substitute in so many schwa sounds. It would take you a really long time to go letter by letter. You can break it into syllables. It's 6 syllables, but there's still a lot of vowel flexing that would need to happen to figure out all of those syllables. But if you can break it into morphemes and recognize that it has 2 prefixes and 1 suffix, then you're really cooking with gas. You can get through that word pretty quickly. Semi-automation. There are different types of morphemes that we can teach to kids. One is free morphemes, which are, of course, just our root words, right? Words that they already probably can recognize from their reading experiences, like popular, truck, and read. Those are the base words that they're going to see show up either in that form or in a slightly modified form in lots of other words. So really just attuning kids to look for those familiar word parts when they come to a new word is going to be a big help. But they can't stop there, right? They can't just see popular and say popular and stop. They have to figure out if it's popularity or population or something else. We have to finish out reading the word to see where this story is going to go. So that involves inflection morphemes, which are things like ed, ing, s, es. Kids can start learning these in first grade. And this helps them, this changes the tense or the number of a word. So if it's a verb, it changes the tense. If it's a noun, it changes how many. This is important for reading fluency, to get the right to read a word that's plurally, or to read a word that is past tense in the past tense form. That helps support reading fluency and pay attention. So paying attention to those things early is really important for kids too. But when we get into the upper grades, these derivational morphemes are really important. Derivational morphemes are prefixes and suffixes that actually change the part of speech of the word or the meaning of the word in some way. So prefixes like d or ris, suffixes like shun or itty, this actually changes the word in a significant and its meaning in a significant way. And sometimes it can change a word from, for example, it can change revolve, which is a verb, into revolution, which is a noun. But it can also change words into their opposite, right? Disinformation is the opposite of information. So these are really important things for kids to be learning about, and really help and can really help them make sense of the text that they're reading if they pay attention to both these as decoding units and as meaning units. There was a recent study by Dawson and colleagues that looked at informational and literary texts for kids at that were written for kids at different grade bands. And for kids in this grade band, like the 3 to 5th grade band, the thing that really stood out was that informational texts were chock full of these derivational morphemes that sort of change one word into another word. So popular into population, constitute into constitution. There are just all kinds of words that kids need to be reading in their social studies and science texts that have these derived suffixes. And so if they learn these prefixes, it's going to give them a lot of support for those challenging texts. And what we know is that from research is that instruction that includes morphology improves multisyllabic word recognition and vocabulary and comprehension for kids at these grade levels. So that's recommendation number 1, or strategy number 1. That's a little bit more big picture, things that you can incorporate into your phonics and word reading instruction. This strategy, I want to move on now to a strategy called every syllable has at least one vowel. And this is a strategy, as I said, developed by Rolanda O'Connor, but there are a number of strategies out there that help kids that are designed to help kids stop when they come across a new word that they haven't read before, and pay attention to all the word parts and make sense of it. And as I said, and there's pretty good research evidence for a number of these strategies. This is just one of them. It's sort of the best researched one out there, but any strategy that helps kids pay attention to the words and texts that they're reading is going to have a big impact on their word reading, on their reading experience of that particular text, but also their word reading over time. I mentioned the team at ETS and some of their research earlier. They just did a study where they compared kids who were good word readers, around that decoding threshold versus kids who were struggling with word reading. And they found that the kids who were pretty good at word reading would spend longer when they came to a word they didn't know, trying to figure it out. Whereas kids who were not very good at word reading tended to just skip over that word and move on and sort of be like, I don't know, I can't do it. And that was correlated. The ability to hang in there and sort of pay attention was predictive of reading growth over time, because every time you encounter a new word in text, that's an opportunity to learn that word. And kids who don't have a strategy or don't have any self-efficacy around this are skipping those words and missing those opportunities. So this strategy which has a terrible name, it's called every syllable has at least one vowel. But I guess it is memorable. Kids do remember the name. But basically, it's designed to just help kids slow down and pay attention to the words that they're reading and make sense of them and not miss those word learning opportunities. So this strategy has 6 steps. The first is to underline all the vowels in a long word. The next is to join any vowel teams that they recognize into one vowel sound. And the next is to identify any word parts that they already know. So gathering that information, they then count the number of word parts to expect, remembering that every syllable has to have at least one vowel. So if they have, 3 vowels and vowel teams, they can expect 3 word parts. And then break the word, break the word into that number of parts, and then try to pronounce each part to sound out the word. So this kind of strategy makes them pay attention to and draw on all of that, the things that they already know about words, and help store that word in memory for next time. So here's an example using the word rotation from the Jupiter book that we looked at earlier. That's something that shows up on that shows up in that text and is one of those derived words that can be difficult for kids. So the first 2 steps are to underline all the vowels in this word. So we would underline O, A, and I-O, and to join any words into any vowel teams into one vowel sound. Now, I haven't been taught that I-O is a vowel team, so I'm not going to join it. But I am curious because it is right next to each other. Whenever I see vowels right next to each other, I get curious about that. But the next step is to look for known word parts. And I know the suffix shun, fortunately. We've already been talking about that. So that makes this whole thing way easier. It's very difficult to sound out the suffix shun if you haven't been taught it as a suffix, because T doesn't make the sh sound in very many other places. And I-O isn't really a vowel team, and it doesn't, and in this case, it's making the schwa sound anyway. So if I just recognize that as a whole word chunk, that makes my life so much easier. So I recognize that suffix, and then I count the number of word parts to expect. I know that the suffix is one part, and there's 2 other vowels. So I have 3 word parts that I need to figure out. Really only 2, because I already know how to say shun. So I break it into parts, and I try to pronounce it. And I might say rotation at first, but that doesn't really make sense. But if I can play around with these vowel sounds and get to rotation, I can connect it to the word rotate. And if I'm familiar with how the suffix shun works, then I am pretty far along figuring out what that word means, especially in this context when we're talking about planets, planet movements. So that's the second strategy. The third strategy that I want to talk about is called wide reading. And Melanie Kuhn at Purdue is a big proponent of this and has done some of the research, but so has some other researchers. And wide reading is really a variation on repeated reading. Oftentimes when we get kids who are struggling with reading in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade who don't sound very fluent when they're reading orally, we think that it's a fluency issue, and so we put them in repeated reading. Repeated reading strategy it usually looks something like, on day 1, we read a text about deserts, and we all read it together and correlate to provide that fluency support. On day 2, we read that same text about deserts again, but this time we echo read it. I read it first, then you read it. On day 3, we read the same text about deserts again, but we do it in partners and read it with our partners or whatever. And this is actually, there's tons of evidence for this strategy in improving oral reading rate and improving reading fluency. So this is one of the better tested strategies out there. However, what Melanie Kuhn and some other researchers have done is compare and contrast that strategy, which again does help kids, with something called wide reading. And wide reading is when you take one of those forms of fluency support, for example, echo read, and you maintain the level of support, but you substitute out the text. So on day 1, you might echo read a text about deserts. And on day 2, you might echo read a text about swamps. And then on day 3, you might echo read a text about caves. And so you're getting new words and new content every day along with that fluency support. And the research, there isn't as much research about wide reading as there is on repeated reading, but what there is shows that they're pretty equally effective at supporting reading fluency and developing reading fluency over time. Obviously, in the specific text, kids are better at reading the desert text if they read it 3 times. But long-term, supporting and developing reading fluency, both of these are pretty effective. And there's some evidence that wide reading might be a slightly better way to build comprehension over time. And that is, again, there's not as much research on wide reading, but what there is very encouraging. And there's some reasons to try this in your classroom if you haven't done it before. It could be more motivating and interesting to your students to read a new text every day instead of the same text. And there's more opportunities to read and learn new words in context. Right? The more words you are, especially if they have a strategy and they have some syllable and morpheme knowledge that they can use to read those new words. Exposure to more words is going to help them become better readers over time. And it might also help them build background knowledge on a greater range of topics if they get to read new texts each day instead of just the same text over and over again. But this strategy can be enhanced by taking what I call a text set approach, or what Sarah Lupo calls a text set. She has a framework called quad text set, but any kind of text set that where kids are reading different texts focused on one topic area will really help them develop their word reading and word reading content area vocabulary and background knowledge. So if you're doing a wide reading approach, you could think about building it into a text set where they are reading not just a different text every day, but a different text on the same topic. So in the example that I showed of deserts, swamps, and caves, those are all ecosystems or habitats for animals, right? And so you could develop a unit around that where kids are reading these accessible texts, something like a decodable high-address chapter book on a different kind of ecosystem every day. But it's paired with some informational text to build background knowledge on what ecosystems or habitats are like, and a hook text or video to get them interested in the topic. And you can do all of that work in preparation for reading something together that would be very hard or challenging for your average student. For example, a textbook chapter. So, these are the grade levels where kids are starting to be responsible for reading textbooks. Not always, but sometimes in 4th and 5th grade, you have a science textbook or a social studies textbook that you're expected to read. Definitely in middle school and high school, that will be a skill that you'll have to do. But an example of a text set approach would be, starting out with a video of solar systems, then doing some informational text reading as a class about how the solar system formed, and then reading and doing that wide reading approach with a series of books on Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, and getting that fluency and the fluency and wide reading practice in texts that are that cover the whole span, that every planet in the solar system, and then ending with reading your science textbook, so that by the time you get there, you've been exposed to some of the same words over and over again. So you recognize those, the content area vocabulary is very familiar with you, and you feel like you're already sort of an expert on this topic, the solar system. So it's less intimidating and challenging to get into that textbook. So one of these things, so all of these strategies are compatible with what you're probably already doing in the classroom, but may be opportunities to enhance. When I look at the ELA curricula that I see teachers here in Michigan using, what I often find is that there isn't a ton of instruction in syllables and morphemes. There's sometimes a lot of instruction on how to divide words into syllables, right? Syllabication rules, but it often doesn't take the next step, which is teaching kids how to use those syllabication rules to read real words that they come across in text. Oftentimes, this is an example from a 4th grade curriculum that some teachers I was working with were using, of the types of words that they were using for their syllabication practice. And you can see that they're all 2-syllable words, and they're all pretty familiar vocabulary, right? The challenge for kids is not reading words like recess necessarily, like they know the word recess, but the challenge is using what they know about syllables to read longer, more content area specific words. So this kind of instruction where they are getting practice using morphemes and syllables to read long, challenging words, that is something that you can often enhance in your curriculum. You can build on this syllabication work that they're doing, but help them take the next step. Often there's not a lot of decoding support for these longer words during reading. Sometimes harder vocabulary words are bolded and like definitions are provided, but actually teaching them how to slow down and work through the word syllable by syllable is something that you can provide, and that you can provide them with support to do that will help them have a better reading experience with their materials and also anything else that they want to read, right? So this is a place where you can supplement. And then opportunities to build word and world knowledge through reading by giving them opportunities to read widely and to read in text sets on topics that interest them that go really beyond your ELA curriculum, right? Like bringing in opportunities to read other things is going to help them build that word and world knowledge. And I find that in a lot of curricula, we're either totally focused on ELA instruction and we aren't really getting into connecting to social studies or science instruction at all, or there is science and social studies instruction, but it's not really connected to what they're doing in the reading stuff. So really opportunities to read more things and to get lots more opportunities reading difficult words with your support are ways that you can improve your reading instruction. So in sum, kids need word reading instruction all the way through the elementary grades. It doesn't stop magically when they hit 2nd grade, but it looks really different from the letter by letter sounding out that they're doing in those early grades. And even kids who are still struggling to pass a test, like a test like the NAEP in 4th and 5th grade, they don't need to go back and necessarily do a a first grade phonics intervention. They need a more sophisticated type of word reading instruction. And they also need that to be paired with a lot of reading reading texts that are accessible to them, but have those multisyllabic words so that they can encounter those words in meaningful contexts, practice their strategies, and actually like make sense of those words and commit them to memory. So those are my recommendations. I know there is a handout that we're going to be providing that has the 3 recommendations on it and some illustrations, so you can remember those if you didn't want to take notes. And I'm happy to turn it back over to Terry, and then also we might have some time for questions and comments at the end.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Tortorelli. It's always great to hear from you. It was excellent. So much goodness. There were so many great takeaways that you shared. 2 specifically that resonated with me were the idea of the decoding threshold, and that our students must meet this threshold by 5th grade to ensure future comprehension, growth, and success. That is so powerful. That really sets into motion almost the urgency and the importance of the work that we do as teachers that are teaching this 3rd through 5th grade, grade band. And then also this need for instruction that includes targeted morphology to improve their multisyllabic word recognition and their vocabulary comprehension. I think that was so good and really, really powerful. So once again, thank you so much for your time. If you guys have any questions for Dr. Tortorelli, please begin adding your questions to the Q&A. And while you add your questions, I'm going to share just a little bit about Just Right Reader and the work that we too are doing to support student reading, okay? So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to share with you some really exciting things. Here we go. So as I said before, I am with Just Right Reader. Just Right Reader was started and founded in 2019 by Sarah Rich. She is an award-winning Mayor's Principal of the Year. She's from Harvard, Penn alum. She is the mother of Izzy, Zach, and Avery. And she found that when she decided to start working with her children, she found that they were struggling with reading also. And she began looking for resources that could help, and there wasn't any. So she did what any other mom would do, and she started to create them for her children. And now that dream, that thing has turned into decodable readers that are being distributed throughout the country to more than 30 million sites. And we are so excited because these decodable books are culturally diverse. They have characters that are engaging and beautiful illustrations that are just really fun to read. And they are beautiful because they allow students to see themselves in their own experiences. They help children learn about other people and places, and they allow us to see the world through their own imagination. And that is so fun. Our decodables have a very rigorous text progression that addresses the phonics skills that Dr. Tortorelli just talked about and shared. And so we're really proud of that. There's explicit phonics instruction in each of our books, and they highlight exactly what we're teaching. And in the inside cover of the book, it addresses all of the words that are listed throughout the book that address that phonics skill. And the beautiful thing about these decodable readers is that they are 80% decodable. Well, that's beautiful. But in addition to that, each page is 20% decodable with the targeted instruction, not just our high frequency words, but rather really honing in on each page the explicit and targeted phonics instruction that the book is trying to teach. And that is really helpful also. Now, we just got finished listening to the importance of really targeting the instruction for our 3rd through 5th grade readers. And this is why Just Right Reader is so exciting, right? Because we have high interest books that address the needs of all of our 3rd through 5th grade learners. They are explicit phonics instructions that we just talked about, those multisyllabic words, those high interest, those fluency words that we're seeing so often in these informational text. And we're excited because we have developed decodables that address those specific skills also. And each of the books comes with a QR code on the back that allows the students to scan the QR code and get targeted instruction by an educator. And this is exciting because we're seeing teachers who are using it in their small group instruction. We're seeing teachers who are teaching that instruction from the classroom, in the classroom, and then sending them to their small groups or sending them to their desks and allowing them to have that reiterated targeted instruction on those skills through that video. So we're really excited about that. I'm going to let you see one of the videos.
Hi friends, my name is Simona. I've been reading this awesome book about swamps. It's part of the Just Right Reader Dangerous Places series. Reading this book is like going on an amazing adventure without leaving your room. I never knew there were so many animals that live in a swamp. Alligators, wolves, and snakes. Oh my! Most of the words are pretty easy to read. If you come across a word you don't know, just take your time, break it down into syllables, and sound it out. There is a glossary to help you with any of the words you might not know, like carnivores. There are a few other things like prefixes and suffixes that will help you read this book.
The prefix by means to. So binoculars have magnifying lenses for 2 eyes. Tri means 3, like in the word trillion. Inter means between or together. So interact means to act together. When the suffix ly is added to the end of an adjective, it forms an adverb, like in the word cautiously.
You're going to love this book. Start reading it today, and I'll see you next time.
We are so proud of our videos. We work really hard to make sure that that targeted instruction is aligned to all the different curriculums. We're really excited because we have the opportunity and the ability to work with any curriculum you're already using, which really speaks directly to what Dr. Tortorelli talked about when she said that we need more practice. Our students need more practice. So it gives you the opportunity to take these books, teach your instruction, and then provide them with more practice as you pull on these different books. We have classroom libraries, and we also have some take-home decodables that allow this multiple experience and continued in practice. We have so many books, and there are a lot of other products out there that have different number of books, but we have multiple titles, which really allows for more and more practice. Now, we talk about our pre-emergent, kindergarten, first and second. We also have 30 titles in English and in Spanish that are in our high interest chapter book library that addresses the needs of students in grades 3 through 5. These high interest books are informational texts as well as narrative texts. They are chapter books that allow for them to learn and engage in a series that allows them to see the same story and the characters over and over again, but also addresses those informational or those nonfiction topics that they're going to be seeing in their classwork. And we have take-home decodable packs that are so exciting because when we get to take these home, now parents get to support the work that's being done in the classroom. And our decodables, our take-home decodables, also have that QR code, which also allows that video to be watched and viewed at home with our parents. The best part is that they are made in the United States. They are designed and printed in the United States, which makes this really fun and exciting for all of us. So if you would like to see what we're doing, I saw some questions in the chat about resources and book suggestions. This would be a great way for you to get your hands on some samples. This QR code or that bit.ly link will get you some samples that you can see in your classroom. You can put them to work and you can see how they are working. So let's go to our questions and let's take some questions. Dr. Tortorelli, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So one of the questions that we saw in the chat was indeed, do you recommend reading for our students before they do the reading themselves?
So reading aloud to them before they read to themselves. So it depends on the goal of your instruction. If you're doing sort of a fluency oriented lesson for kids who need a lot of support, reading a text aloud to students is the first step in like a 4E type of reading lesson. So you would read it aloud to them and then they could choral read, echo read, or partner read, and kind of gradually release their support. But they eventually do need support doing that reading themselves. So what I like about the wide reading approach is giving them an opportunity to picking one level of support and giving them opportunities to read a lot of texts with that level of support. So for example, echo reading a bunch of texts so that they are doing the reading too. So if you have kids who really need a lot of support, then choral read, you can read a text to them first and then kind of gradually reduce the support. But the important thing is that they get lots of opportunities to learn how to tackle difficult texts on their own as well.
Thank you. That's a great answer. There's another question here that asks, what would you suggest for a 5th grader entering 6th grade who has not reached the decoding threshold?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to make it clear that it's not that these kids are doomed for all time, right? The reason the decoding threshold is important is that there's not very much instruction in word reading once you hit middle school. Like that's just not how English language, ELA class is set up. But it's not that those kids can't still learn how to do this reading. And so one of my research projects is really looking at providing kids with scaffolding while they're doing their reading practice. So making sure that whenever they come to a new word, we're just like on the fly teaching them the word parts they need to learn to try to catch them up. So they're reading the text and then we're like, oh, that's actually a prefix. We actually give them like a little list of prefixes and suffixes as a support that they can use while they're reading, and trying to give them that on the fly support so that they are encountering lots of new words in text and processing those. And we're like providing them with what they sort of, instead of teaching them what they need and then sending them out to read, teaching them what they need to read that text that day and sort of helping them through those reading experiences so that they're not missing out on those opportunities. So again, the study about on the decoding threshold is just descriptive. It means it says what is happening to those kids. It's not saying what has to happen. We can absolutely support kids who haven't met the decoding threshold by the end of 5th grade, but that's a lot of that's extra, something that they won't get necessarily if we don't intervene.
Yeah, I like that. That was a great answer. This one is a really good question also. What about struggling readers and students with dyslexia? Will these strategies be too hard for them?
Yeah, so actually, that's a great question too. One of the things, particularly teaching the syllables and morphemes, is something that's recommended by Devin Kearns at University of Connecticut, who is a fantastic dyslexia scholar. And one of the things he argues is that just teaching the word parts is easier for kids who have dyslexia or may have other language processing things going on, because they don't have to remember a bunch of rules. Like he argues, and I've heard other scholars argue this as well, that if you're teaching kids to remember rules, they have to kind of go out of the reading experience, remember the rule, go apply the rule, and then go back into the reading experience. And that's actually quite a high cognitive load for kids who are already having some reading difficulties. So really just being very straightforward about teaching the word parts and using the word parts is going to be easier than things like trying to remember all the syllabication rules and how to apply them.
Yeah, that's great. And that answered another one of the questions that just said, do you have suggestions for advanced decoding skills practice? And I think you kind of answered that, but do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is that they are slow, that they get exposure to lots of texts and have a plan for when they encounter a new word. And so that the important thing, what I'm finding in my research project is that when I give kids an authentic a text that they want to read because they're interested in swamps or they're interested in caves or whatever, the words they're encountering are much harder than the words that they'll encounter just through any sort of, scope and sequence decoding program. So really the reading, the text that they're reading and making sure they're using those learning opportunities are the best ways to move their decoding forward.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. So how is wide reading different from independent reading?
Oh, that is such a good question. Independent reading is something that is something that kids are just kind of doing on their own. They get to usually pick a text on their own, and they're just kind of spending maybe 10, 15 minutes reading without any scaffolding from the teacher or from their peers. Wide reading is something that's a little bit more planned and can involve scaffolding. So, for example, you're going to select the text as the teacher to give them the practice that you want them to have with particular content area or particular words, and you're going to be there on hand to provide them with support. So if that might be echo reading, or it might be partner reading, but they're not necessarily just off on an island reading by themselves. They're getting support from you or their peers, and you're choosing the text that they're reading.
I like that. That is great. That is really, really great. And if you have questions regarding Just Right Reader or our products, you can always find us online at justrightreader.com. I thank you so much, and we will talk to you guys soon. Thank you. Until next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy reading.